you are going to be participating in is something that's wonderful, planning for the future. And before we do that, we're going to do some very practical things for right now, such as making sure everyone has access to the translation if you need that. And all of you have headphones, okay? And on the apparatus that's in front of you, the button to access the translation is on the side. Per quelle di voi che che avete bisogno della traduzione,
so if you need translation, you have this little device in front of you. To the side, there is a button. You can push the button and you will listen to the translation if necessary, if you need.
Everyone now here? Okay. So when we open the floor to discussion and you would like to participate, at that moment, the button that's on top of the machine, you can press that button and then a red light will appear like you can see on my microphone. And that means that your microphone is then open, okay? Now, the other thing we'd like to know, as soon as you have access to that microphone, the camera will move to you and your image will then be transmitted both online immediately and then on the recorded program when it's uploaded to YouTube. Are all of you okay with your image being transmitted? Okay, we're all okay with it. Wonderful. Okay. I think now we can leave these practical matters and start our planning for the future. Last year, we held an event hosted in January on the newly released document on economy at the service of the charism and ministry. And that was hosted with Father Thomas McLean, the General Treasurer of the Jesuits. And we decided to follow up because we understood that many of you were looking for some more practical information on the actual management of goods and assets in your communities. And thanks to the other work I do, I met Helen Harrington. I was looking for someone who could accompany me to do a commentary while the Pope was in Ireland. And in the meantime, I found out what she does. Well, I couldn't help but not invite her. So here we are today. Not only that, but I mean, this is a real record turnout. Generally, not everyone shows up who registered, but 21 people registered to be here presently, and there's about 25 of you here. So we leave it to treasurers, right? We'll have to remember that for our statistics. And there were 76 registered who are participating throughout the world in the webinar. So there are sisters who are joining us from Australia, from Austria, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, England, France, Germany, India, Ireland, Israel, the Philippines, Portugal, and the United States. And we even have Helen's mom in the audience. No, I think this is wonderful. So Mom Helen, we just want to let you know we're very, very, very grateful for your daughter along with you. So today I'm pleased to present Helen. She's an independent consultant based in Rome who specializes in supporting the leadership teams of religious institutes in all aspects of resource planning. She provides a range of advisory services to congregations, as we know who we are now facing increasing challenges in a very changing world. We will be able to listen to Helen, who's prepared a presentation which has been emailed to you for your reference, and for about an hour, and then we will have the opportunity of speaking in our groups so that we see what other information we'd like to ask from Helen or feedback that may emerge. Any of you joining us through the webinar, you can feel free at that moment to begin a discussion via chat. So without further participation on my part. Here's Helen.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. And listening to the list of countries, I feel I have to say good evening, good morning, or whatever time zone you are in. And yes, it is true, my mother is watching this live because it's her only opportunity to see me at work. So it's very nice to have her here with me. And so we have other people online. I don't know who that is, but welcome, everyone. So it really is a pleasure for me to be here with you. Just as Sister Bernadette has said, my presentation this afternoon will be about 45 or 50 minutes. And then I want to make sure that there is plenty of time for you all to have a discussion or to ask any questions that you may already have, or questions that come up as part of my presentation. But it really is a pleasure for me to be here with you all. So just to give you some background about myself, as Sister Bernadette has said, I am an independent consultant. I'm Irish, and I was previously based in Dublin working for a company called L&P. And I am now and have been resident in Rome for the past 5 years. So I have more than 13 years experience in working with religious congregations. My background is in statistical data analysis. So I've worked in various fields like healthcare and banking. But I now try and apply my statistical and data analysis background to working with religious congregations, because as Bernadette said, increasingly the world is a changing place and religious congregations have had to adapt with that changing world. So I try and assist congregations with that, mainly through planning. When Sister Bernadette asked me to do this presentation, I was really very happy because for me, planning is one of my favorite subjects. So for me, really, this is not really work. It's more kind of, you know, a good fun thing I can do for a Friday afternoon. I primarily work here in Rome with international leadership teams, supporting them in lots of different aspects of future planning. And I also provide other consultancy services to congregations as well, mainly in the areas of facilitation and also some HR related work as well. One of the main areas of my work and the topic I'm really going to speak about today is about planning for the future. And one of the things that I specialize in is a thing called a congregation study. And I have actually done some congregation studies for people present here in this room today. But just to say that in terms of my experience, I've done about 20 of these different studies for various congregations of different sizes, of based in different countries around the world. So, and I have traveled extensively around the world visiting congregations. So I think that experience really gives me an insight into the life of religious congregations. So I want to begin with 3 questions that, you know, as we go through the process this afternoon, I would like you all to kind of think about. The first question is, how do you plan for the future? Most of you present here today or listening, you are involved at some level, I assume, in leadership, whether you are a superior general, a member of a general council, or leadership team in whatever form it has, or a treasurer general. And really first question I have for many congregations is, how do you plan for the future? The second question is, who does the planning? Who is responsible for planning within your congregation? And linked to that as well is, how do you make decisions? Because when you're looking towards the future, there are obviously clear decisions that have to be made. And another link to that is, who do you involve in the process? Because obviously people have to be consulted. So it's just 3 very basic questions to begin. And I'll go through some of them in more detail, but it's really just to set you off with the question and to try and help you, I think, to think about this. One thing that I always say is that there is a need for planning at all levels within a congregation. It is not something that should be done just at the highest level within an international congregation by the General Council. It is something that should be done at all levels, from the very basic community level to a more local provincial level, and then obviously as a wider congregation. But it's not something that should just be done from a very high level perspective. One thing that's very important for planning is it provides you with information on options that are available to you. I'm going to speak about this in great detail today, about the need to have information. So often when I meet those in leadership, whether that's a Treasurer General or a Superior General in her council, I ask them, well, what information did you have to take that decision? I find it very difficult when often they reply to me, well, sister such and such or father such and such told me, or that was my experience from visiting somewhere. There are no hard facts or data. I'm not saying that visiting somewhere and getting the experience of others is not valuable, but I'm saying that having knowledge and information should be the first step you take when you're trying to make a decision. I see some nodding heads, so I think that's a positive thing. Another very clear thing that I like to say to those in leadership is that you should try and take decisions when you have time for planning. And again, more nodding heads. But very often, and unfortunately sometimes, I am brought into congregations when they have no options left, when they have been forced into something because it was too difficult to take a decision many years ago, or because the information was simply not there, and you come to a point in which you only have maybe 1 or 2 options, and you are forced into something. Rather than looking forward to the future and saying, what are the possibilities? And do we need to take a decision now so that it can be better for us in the future? It really is a difficult thing to do, but it really is something that is prudent and should be done by those in leadership. I used to work in a previous life in management consultancy, and so working a lot with businesses. And the biggest change for me that I had to take when I started working with religious congregations is understanding this thing called mission. And the understanding that decisions are not always taken from the perspective of financial assets or resources, like they are in probably the rest of the world, but that the first criteria for decisions and actions at every level is fidelity to the mission. I see it so many times when decisions are taken and it might end up costing the congregation more money, or it might mean that they require more personnel, but it is all because of the mission. And it's really one of the reasons that I enjoy working for religious congregations, because of this. And really the question that I am asking, and so many congregations are asking now, is how can a congregation continue to sustain the mission? given the changing world in which we live, given the reality of religious life today and potentially into the future. But for most, particularly female congregations, membership is declining from a global perspective. And really the question for those in leadership is, how can we continue to sustain our mission going into the future? And what do we need to do to be able to plan for that? One of the other, I think, huge challenges in relation to the planning and management of your resources or your assets is the fact that all of the resources and assets within your institutes and congregations are for the benefit of the whole. And yet, they are all held in individual civil legal entities around the world. So you have this very difficult balance between, well, yes, everything belongs to the one body or to the whole congregation, and yet your assets are managed and have to be managed in individual structures around the world. A lot of congregations, in looking to the future now, are talking about, well, how do we sustain ourselves into the future? And can we put everything together as one? I hear this question all the time. And in theory, it is a beautiful, lovely thing to say, yes, everything is one. We have common mission, therefore everything is the one body. The practical reality of that is very difficult, very difficult. But it does not mean it cannot be done. The other thing is about who is responsible for the assets and resources of an international congregation. Those in leadership, so whether you are a superior general or a member of a general council, you are responsible for the management, or we say in English also, the stewardship of the resources of your congregation. It is not solely the responsibility of the treasurer or the bursar. I see the treasurers and bursars nodding and saying yes. I think there is sometimes the perception from superior generals, I see this a lot, that the treasurer or the bursar, well, they are responsible for finances. Ultimately, no, the superior general is ultimately responsible for everything. Yes, you can pass over the management of those to your treasurer, but you are responsible for them. And it's something that's very important for superiors general and councils to understand. So when I speak about resources or the assets of a congregation, what are we actually talking about? For those of you who have worked with me, this is a very familiar diagram. But ultimately, there are three main resources within any institute or congregation. The primary resource is your members. Without membership, you have no mission. Without membership, you cannot serve in ministry. Without membership, you have no life within your congregation. But your members have to be supported by the other assets and resources of property and finance. Finance is a very general term, but it's related to all of the income and expenditure that you have within your congregation, but also the financial resources that you have within your congregation as well. But surrounding all of these assets and resources is always the life and mission of your congregation. Life and mission impact those resources. You take decisions based on life and mission. But it also works the other way around. Those resources can also impact your life and mission. If you are a congregation with limited financial resources, it may not mean that you can live your mission in the way in which you would like to. And so you have to take different decisions. But life and mission and resources cannot be looked at separately. Everything has to be taken as one. Visca, or sickle cell, however you'd like to call it, produced guidelines for the administration of assets in 2014. This is a copy of the booklet, which is a shorter version. I asked someone recently about this conference, and she said to me that it was one of the most boring conferences she had ever attended, but the handbook and booklet that came out of it is one of the most useful documents she has ever read. So I would encourage you, if you have not read it, and whether you are a treasurer general, a superior general, someone in leadership, I would recommend that you read this document. It gives very practical guidelines in terms of administering the assets of your congregation. It gives recommendations about how your assets should be managed. It outlines the fact that all assets of religious congregations are ecclesiastical assets. And this, again, I think is something that is a difficult thing sometimes to balance in terms of managing assets from a worldwide or a global perspective. It also outlines the need for transparency and professional management of your assets, which is becoming increasingly difficult in the world. And also how the economic dimension, so managing assets, really is linked to both people, to your membership, to individuals, and also your mission. So really, I would encourage you, if you have not read it, that you do so. And I'll talk a little bit about it as well today. So when Sister Bernadette asked me to speak today, I wanted to be able to speak to you from a very practical perspective. Because many times when I meet with congregations, they know they need to plan for the future. They know they need to try and make decisions to look ahead, but they really don't know where to start. So what I'm going to outline for you this afternoon is 3 very practical aspects of planning and try and give you some more detail about them. Each of these aspects of planning are linked to each other. But really, the first thing that I would say to any congregation is, do you have knowledge about your assets and your resources within your congregation? A question I often ask is very simple. What resources do you have in your congregation? I'll come to it in more detail. The next step after knowledge is trying to incorporate that knowledge with your plans for the future. We live in a very changing world, but really it's to try and see, well, how can we sustain our mission going into the future? What are our hopes and dreams for our congregation as we look forward into the future? But what are the practical realities that we have to take into consideration in order to realize those hopes and dreams? And then there is what I consider one of the most difficult things, is trying to look at, well, what is the implication of all of this in terms of planning for the future? What decisions do we have to take? And really, what procedures are necessary then to make sure that we can ensure the stewardship of our resources? So as I said, these three aspects of planning really are connected to each other. You have knowledge, you have planning for the future, and then you have the implications and the practical realities. The fact is that planning is something that is always continuing. It's not something that you do for 5 years and then it stops and everything is fantastic and great and you don't need to plan anymore. Unfortunately, planning is something that you have to do all the time. It is this continuous cycle that you must always be on. But it is something that is very necessary for the future in terms of managing your resources and trying to deal with the changing world in which we live. So this first question of knowledge. So what assets or resources do you have within your congregation? For me, I think this should be a very simple question to answer. The reality is very different because, as I've already said, in any international congregation, the resources you hold are in different and distinct legal entities around the world. To try and put all of that information together in one place can be very difficult. But as leadership, you have a responsibility to know what you have. You don't need to know the exact detail of everything, but you do have a responsibility to know what resources you have within your congregation. I would hope that when you begin, that some of that information is already available to you. That you have a membership database or a list of your members around the world. That you understand what different civil legal structures exist within your congregation. You may have access to financial reports, whether they are audited or not. My favorite one, information on property, having a list of the properties that you own around the world. I'm just going to add, most congregations do not have this, from my experience. And also knowing as well, what ministries do we have around the world? Because from in working with congregations, I understand there are very different structures in terms of ministries. Ministries that you are legally responsible for, ministries in which you own the buildings, but you are no longer responsible for the management of those ministries. Ministries where maybe you have 1 or 2 sisters working there, but you are not legally responsible for them. But it is very important that you know what you have and the different structures that you have as well. If you are also financially responsible for that ministry, it's important that you have that information available to you as well. If you do not have the knowledge, you don't have the information available to you, it is possible for you to seek that knowledge and to carry out what I call a congregation study. I know that some of you, many of you, will already carry out, either you call it a study, you call it projections, you do modeling for your congregation. And sometimes it happens at a much more local level rather than an overall congregation level. But overall, what a congregation study does is it looks at these 3 different aspects, these 3 different resources available in your congregation. And it gathers information about these 3 resources and looks at it not only from the current perspective of what you have now but also then looks at, well, what is also the potential for the future? This is the type of work that I have focused on for the past 13 years in working with religious congregations. This is where my background in data analytics has been very useful to me. But really, this is not the most complicated part of planning. This is the very first step and should be the most basic step. But it can be difficult to gather all of this knowledge and get it into one place. But unless you have a picture of your whole congregation, it's very difficult, I think, for you to try and decide then, but where are we going in terms of the future? I think often when you work in leadership, you go on visitation and you can see what is happening around the congregation. But it's not until you put hard facts and the reality of the congregation in front of your members or in front of your team, and that you can actually say, no, this is our reality. This is the facts and the knowledge about our congregation. And if you have that basic knowledge, it can help you then prepare for what may happen in the future. Any congregation study that I have done, really the focus is, and if you do a similar study, should be on membership. They are, as I've said, the most important resource of any congregation. They live the mission of the congregation each day, both through their community life and their life in ministry as well. They also are very connected to the other resources within your congregation as well. Members earn income, they have community expenses, they live and work in your properties that you own. So really it is these resources of finance and property that support your membership. I like to say to Treasurers General, or to even those who work in finance and those in leadership, really these resources of finance and property, they should be there as the support. They should not be the problem that you are trying to focus on. The thing that you should be trying to focus on in leadership is mission and your members. But that's not the practical reality. It is these two resources of finance and property that can often create the biggest headaches for those in leadership. Whether it is a property which you own the building, but you do not own the land on which it is built, and all of a sudden the bishop has come along and says, I'm sorry, we would like to take our land back. The sisters must move. I see people smiling, and it's a good example because it happens in many different places around the world. But if you understand what resources you have, if you understand your financial situation and reality in the countries where you are, if you know what property you have, often you can try and plan for the future and foresee some of the difficulties that may arise and make decisions before these terrible things may happen. Really, if there's one thing you take home from today, it's really, I would say, please try and have information, try and understand and have the knowledge, because it really can help you so that you don't run into problems in the future. Because once you understand both your current reality and possible future reality, when I do congregation studies and try and look forward to the future for congregations, I always say, I don't have a crystal ball. I cannot predict the future. That's not my special skill. But really, if you have some understanding of the fact that your membership may decrease in the future, or The change in membership means that your congregation is moving away from Europe and North America and towards Africa. How can you make decisions now that will make that change easier for everyone into the future? And what changes do you need to make to your resources to make that change easier as well? There are things that you can do if you have knowledge. Because ultimately, what you want to do is to sustain your mission. And you also, though, have responsibility for stewardship of these resources, not only now, but for the future of your congregation as well. So the next kind of phase in terms of planning, and once you have your knowledge, and you can also do this stage running concurrently, so running at the same time, is to try and see, well, what are your plans for the future of your congregation? How can you continue to sustain life and mission? But also, what are your hopes and dreams for your congregation? Planning sometimes seems to be this very boring exercise where we just gather information and try and see what is happening. But it really should be this wonderful thing for you as well, where you say, well, how can we continue to live our mission? And what dream do I have for the future of my congregation? And if I have this dream, how can I make that a reality? And planning can really help you to do that. Because yes, there are practical realities, but in most cases, practical realities can be overcome. There are ways in which you can manage your resources so that you can achieve these hopes and dreams. So really, this stage of planning is trying to balance these hopes and dreams that you have and trying to say, okay, given the knowledge that I have about what resources and assets we have within our congregation, what is achievable for us going into the future? And can I gather all of this into some kind of plan, some kind of structure for the future? And what are the steps that we need to take in order to achieve these dreams? Now, I say this, and it's very easy for me to say, yes, you just combine your dreams with your practical realities, and it's very easy. But this is really one of the most difficult things that you can do, because to have a dream is a wonderful thing, but often you are constrained by the resources that you have. But I would prefer that congregations are hopeful and not pessimistic. And there are ways in which you can overcome the challenges you have in relation to resources. In many cases, when I have done congregation studies for different institutes and congregations, after we have gathered all of the knowledge and we have all of this information and we're trying to look at planning for the future, we have to look at, well, what are the implications of such a study and what decisions have to be taken? And this can be a very challenging thing to do. The list I have put up here is quite short, but really I could probably talk about the implications for congregations and their resources for about 5 or 6 hours very easily. But for example, anytime that I look at the membership of a congregation, we look at a demographic study to say, this is the number of sisters potentially going forward over the next 20 years. There are so many different questions that come up, even from looking just at membership. For most female congregations, international female congregations, membership is declining across the world from a global perspective. Yes, there are some countries in the world where membership is increasing, certain countries in Africa and certain countries in Asia. But even if membership is in decline or membership is increasing, there are questions that need to be asked and decisions that need to be taken. For example, in the terms of generally sisters within Europe, North America, Japan, and Australia, care of older sisters, care of your aging members. It's a huge consideration for so many congregations. And in terms of what is appropriate for the life of our sisters as they age. It's also becoming a big question now in many African and Asian provinces around the world, because these are countries where generally the sisters would have been younger, but now there are older sisters or older members, and it's trying to look at, well, what is appropriate for the care of these members in the future? Do we have to start building aged care facilities for our members? Do we have to look at collaboration with other congregations? Is there a private healthcare system available for our members? So even this one aspect in terms of aging sisters can raise so many different questions. If you look at it from the other perspective, in terms of you have a younger, growing membership, you have to consider all of the different aspects in relation to formation. And resources available for formation is not specifically financial resources, but it's also, more importantly, resources of sisters available to provide that formation. And if you are declining in numbers in other parts of the world, do you have sisters available for formation in these new, younger, growing areas? So these are two very different ends of the spectrum. But there is everything else in between as well in terms of leadership. If you have declining numbers, who are your future leaders? And what formation are you giving those members? Not only in terms of leadership at a local or community level, but also leadership at a congregation level. And I speak a little bit about this at the end, but formation for finance as well. One of the things that I think often gets forgotten about a little bit by those in leadership is the need to have sisters or members trained in the area of finance. So that is even a very small aspect in terms of the life of sisters and formation. But there are so many other implications that you may need to consider. For example, ministry. If you are continuing your mission to sustain your mission into the future, often the question I get asked is, well, how can we do this? Particularly for congregations who may have been involved in very formal ministry in the past. They have been involved in the provision of education, the provision of healthcare. They have had huge schools and hospitals in different parts of the world. But now, when they look towards the future, they are moving away from institutional ministry. And so the face of how they are providing, how they're continuing their mission is changing. But what does that mean for the sisters and the members of the congregation? What does that also mean then in terms of structures from both a legal perspective, but also from a financial perspective? Because often in the past, it is these ministries who provided income to a province or to a congregation. And if that income is no longer there, what does that mean for the future of the congregation? So that's, again, some of the other implications in relation to ministry. Future finances. I think one of the most common questions I am asked is about the sharing of resources. And I touched on it a little bit at the beginning of this presentation. But in a changing congregation, and often in a changing congregations where maybe membership is reducing in what we would call the global north, so whether that is Europe, America, Australia, and Japan, often this is where the majority of financial resources are held within an international congregation. But given changing membership, it is very unlikely that that is where future members will be located. So how do you have a balance within a congregation where you have members who are often aging, who may require healthcare, who have commitment to ministries? How do you balance their needs with the needs of sisters in more developing countries where maybe there are vocations, where you are trying to develop ministry? How do you balance those two things within a congregation? There are also structures that you have to consider, both from a canon law perspective and a civil law perspective. If you have changing demographics within your congregation, do you change to one single congregation structure? Do you dissolve whatever local structures you have? You get rid of provinces or districts and you become one congregation. Do you change your provinces and ask provinces to join together so that you are creating different structures? But what implications does that have then in relation to civil structures that you may have in different countries? What are the different issues that you have to consider? So really, I mean, I touch on this very generally, and I'm very happy to take specific questions on these if you would like to, but it's just to give you an understanding of, once you have this knowledge and you are trying to plan for the future, there are so many other things that you have to start considering. But to do it without knowledge and to do it without some kind of direction for the future to know where you're going, it's very difficult to make these kinds of decisions. So really, that is what I'm trying to emphasize today. This final thing I say, what decisions have to be taken based on these realities? This is the most significant challenge for those in leadership. But you should try and plan for these decisions and not be forced into them. So this is probably more appropriate for Treasurers General, but there are tools and procedures that can assist you as well in the management of your resources or the stewardship of your resources. Congregations should have appropriate legal structures, and I say civil and canonical, depending on what resources you have available to you. Particularly if you are an international congregation and you are trying to manage worldwide resources and worldwide assets and make donations internationally. Because of everything that happens in the world today, making international transfers is just becoming more and more difficult. And making sure that you have the appropriate legal structures so that you can do this is becoming more and more important. I cannot stress this enough because I hear it from so many different congregations about the need to transfer money to various different parts of the world, particularly Africa, and the challenges that they have in even trying to make simple transfers. But having appropriate legal structures can help you with that. Budgeting and forecasting, monitoring your finances. So once you have this knowledge about what resources you have, it's appropriate that you monitor those resources and that you plan for the future to know what resources you may have in the future. Internal controls, the need to make sure that, because ultimately the Superior General is responsible for the resources of your congregation, you need to make sure that you have appropriate controls in place in all of the countries in which you are based, so that your resources are not mismanaged. And that means that although you have different personnel in different countries, there should be controls in place so that you can monitor those resources. Management of property. Once you all have this very detailed list of properties that I'm sure you will all be going back now to your congregations to check to see if you have it. But management of property, if you know what property you have, it can help you plan then to see what property may we need in the future. And that is linked to, well, what are your plans for the future of your congregation? If you plan to stay in institutional ministries, well, then you need institutional ministry properties. But if you know that you may be leaving your institutional ministries, what management do you need to put in place for those properties? Can they start to generate income for you? Do you have to sell them? Do you have to donate them to the diocese because that is your only option? But it's about looking at the different ways in which you need to manage the property that you own. Many congregations now will have investment funds, and making sure that those investment funds are both managed appropriately and also are in the correct structure can assist you in terms of the stewardship of those resources. There is a lot of discussion, and particularly within religious congregations, about the appropriate management of investments and whether, one, they should be ethically invested, but also the new term that people are discussing is impact investing. How can religious congregations use the investments that they have to invest in companies that make the world a better place? For example, investing in companies that generate renewable energy. This is a very good example, because this is a growing industry, so it can generate a profit and it can generate income for the religious congregation. But it also means that you are investing in a company that is trying to change the world in a positive way. So having investments doesn't necessarily mean that it is a negative thing. I hear that sometimes from religious congregations, that they would like to invest, but they don't want to be involved in this very capital market where it's all about making money. It doesn't have to be like that. There are ways in which you can structure your investments, which mean that you are both earning income, but also impacting the world in a positive way. Communication and transparency are kind of more overarching aspects of management of your resources, but communicating what resources you have to your members is so important. Most of the time when I do a congregation study, I will present to a general chapter or a meeting of provincials, and most of them will say that they had a good understanding of their local contexts, but they never understood the global context. They never understood completely the reality of the whole congregation. And it's such an important thing to do, because it can really help in terms of trying to, when you are planning for the future and trying to make difficult decisions, if you have the knowledge and you communicate it to your members, often these difficult decisions become a little bit easier. I often hear this as well in relation, and I see it in relation to congregations where, yes, the financial resources are in the global north, but the need for those resources is in the global south. if you can show this from a very practical perspective, you show the reality of your congregation to all of your members. So often in congregations, I can see this shift to actually the money isn't ours individually, it's not our provinces, it is the congregations, and they see the need. But unless you provide that information to your members, unless you open their eyes to the reality, it's very difficult for them to see that, to understand the reality of the whole. And that's when people start holding on to, well, no, this money is ours and I need it for our aged care and our older sisters and our schools. But if you show the reality, so often I see this change in congregations where they say, well, no, actually, I didn't realize, or I had some understanding because we had sisters from Congo or we had sisters from Uganda who came to stay with us. But now I can see what is potentially going to happen in the future. So, okay, it's not ours anymore. And maybe the need is here and not with us anymore. But unless you give the information to sisters, I don't see, or to your members, I really don't see how they are expected to see what is required for the future and how they are expected to make that change. Two final slides before we finish for a break, or we take a short break. One of the things that is outlined, and maybe as a layperson, I say this with great joy, but outlined in this document from Saviska is to say that the management of your assets is very complex. It is becoming more and more complicated. But assistance is available from lay people. Often I say to congregations that lay people can provide a professional service to a congregation, and it means then that your members are available for mission. One of the great joys of my life in terms of working for religious congregations is that although I do not live and work, I do not live the mission of congregations, I know that the work that I do helps members so that they can live their mission. Really, for me, that gives me great joy. If I can help you plan so that your mission is sustained for the future, that's an extra bonus for me. But you have to make sure as well that you support these lay people. We are not religious. We have a certain understanding of religious life, but it's very important for lay people that they understand your mission and your charism so that they can live it in a different way, but they can live it alongside you. It's also extremely important that you understand that ultimate responsibility for your assets still lies with your congregation leadership. Yes, you can delegate tasks and certain things to lay people, to others, but the ultimate responsibility still comes back to those in leadership. There is also the possibility as well of collaboration. So I know that many congregations now, when they're looking towards planning for the future, is they're looking at how can we collaborate with another congregation? How can we collaborate with a lay associate? How can we collaborate with the local church? But it's another way you can sustain the mission into the future, is by collaborating with others, because maybe you don't have the resources available. But collaboration as well also means that you can learn from each other. So it means that maybe one congregation has a similar mission, but carries out their ministry in a different way. But how can you combine your two ministries together so that both missions continue into the future? My last slide is about financial formation. And in this, again, I quote this document again from Saviska, but within this it says that the evangelical dimension of our finances should not be neglected in the formation process, especially the training of those who will have responsibility for governance, i.e. those in leadership. One thing, though, that I think should be very clear is that every member of a congregation should understand finances. It is not good enough for sisters to say, oh, I don't like finances, I don't understand, therefore I'm not responsible. Every individual member has a responsibility, most cases, for a personal budget. Therefore, they should understand how much money they are spending, how much money they receive, at a very, very simple level. I'm not asking them to understand alienation of property or anything complicated, but very basic understanding of finances and their personal responsibility for it. Because for every member understanding finances, the knowledge is built up within the congregation. But you have to make sure that you also have appropriate formation for finance as well. One of the aspects of planning you really need to consider within congregations is for the future financial leaders of your congregation at a community level, a provincial level, a congregation level. Some of it can be delegated to lay people, but you still need to have understanding of finances within your congregation so that you can have these internal controls that I spoke about. So it is important, but I really cannot stress enough the need for financial formation, because often when there are problems and when there are issues with finance, it's because people simply didn't understand, they didn't have this knowledge. And really, that's where problems can occur. So that is the end of my presentation for this afternoon. So, oh, I'm only 1 minute past 4, I did quite well. But I think we're having a very short break. So if you to talk with those people around you, if you want to get up and stretch, or those watching from the comfort of their homes and offices can get up and make a cup of tea or have a cup of coffee. But we're just going to take a short break, and then there will be time for discussion and questions. So thank you very much. Oh, no, people at home, not here. No, I said if you're at home. No, I didn't say for here. No.
And at that point, those of us who may need a translation into English can use the headphones to understand the question in Italian. And we can also take questions online. So if any of you who are participating in the webinar would like to ask some questions, please feel free. So the floor is now open. Right in the front, yeah.
I'm Josephine Sim, Canossian sister. This is probably a statement. You know that every 6 years we elect the new General Council. And so sometimes it depends who gets voted into the General Council. Yes, we have put up internal controls, set up systems, but sometimes it depends on who are the people in charge during these 6 years. And you have stressed more than once that, that the resources and assets are the responsibility of the council. And for me, I think sometimes it depends on who are the people who are involved. For example, there is one group that will say, our priority is not in finance. Our priority is in formation. Okay, that's good. But we know that formation needs money. But because the priority is in formation, then the emphasis will be more on helping the sisters and forming the young to the old. And finance is kind of like put aside. Then we have another general. She's a accounts trained. She's very, very eager. She started to change the system. And so for 6 years, she did quite a lot. But when she finished, everything that she had started slowly went backwards. So I have no solution. I only think, yes, we can do something at the chapter, we said, at the general chapter, depending on who are the people, the participants at the chapter, to make some changes that can sustain. It's like the government too. Once you have a new government, policies change, the rules change. So I have no idea. I'm just wondering what you have to say. Thank you.
Yes, it's very true, actually. A lot of the time when I come to work with a congregation, generally I come to a point where they are a few years before chapter and they're preparing for a general chapter. And then at the chapter, so the focus has been on gathering information and finding this knowledge. And because the Superior General or Treasurer General, whoever has appointed me at the time, that has been their focus. You go to chapter, everything changes. But what I would say is that the focus for every congregation is, as I've said many times today, about sustaining your mission. So that should be the same. And your one commonality within your congregation is your mission. Regardless of what your focus is, the thing you need to look at overall is sustaining your mission. And it's important that a Superior General and her council understand that in order to do that, you have to make sure that you manage your resources. It's that diagram that I had where membership was at the top, finance and property are supporting them, and life and mission surrounds it. That should be the focus for every council and every Superior General, regardless of their preferences towards formation or their preferences towards finances or other things. It shouldn't really be about that. You have to make sure you need assets and you need resources to continue your mission. And so ultimately, it shouldn't be the focus is one way or the other. Finance and property should be the stable thing that supports your life and mission. I know it's not easy, and I don't know if I am the person to comment on new leadership coming in and them changing, but that is what I would say in terms of resources. Yeah.
There are two questions, but they are similar. How long does a congregational study usually take? And the second one is the same. How long does a congregational study take when a province has the information available for the study?
The time it takes for a congregation study is very dependent, firstly, on the size of the congregation, because if you are a congregation of 3,500 sisters in 45 countries, that's a very different scenario to a congregation of 250 sisters in 4 countries. So that's one big factor that you have to take into consideration. The other thing is about availability of information, about the knowledge that you already have within your congregation. Some congregations, all of their information is centralized and is available at wherever their central leadership team is. And that can make the process of a study much easier than if you have to go to lots of different countries or different entities and gather the information from there. So there's no easy answer to say how long is a study, because it really depends on a lot of different factors. One thing I would say is that once you have gathered all the information, done projections or different things, that's not the end of the study. Really, what the study will give you is knowledge and information, but there are so many things after that and that is the hard work, it really is. So it's not a process that is, yes, the study itself may take 1 year or 2 years, but really the process is much longer in terms of planning.
I'm Sister Alfonsa, Franciscan sister. First of all, I want to thank you for this presentation, because it gives us, and I could see my superior general on the screen, it affirms us, it gives us a lot of energy, because for the past 6 years, we have been trying to follow what you have been doing. And I would just like you to say something more about the appropriate legal system. What do you mean by that, and how practical? It's very difficult for us, in different countries, because one country has this, other country has this, and especially in Africa where, ministries, we are called ministries of the church, as the booklet says, ecclesiastical property. And there is now so much, difficulties to differentiate what is our patrimony and what belongs to the diocese, because in the 1920s, nobody was talking about even contracts. So we are well, if you say something about the legal system, that will help us. Thank you.
In terms of legal structures and even the examples that you're giving there's kind of 2 separate things. One is civil legal structures and about what is appropriate for your congregation in the country in which you are based. So it depends very much on the civil law of the country, but in most cases it's some form of charitable structure that congregations have in the countries in which they are based, which means that in certain cases you may not pay taxes or you may get a reduction of taxes. That's not always the case, but it just means that it can assist you in terms of how you operate. But I'm not a lawyer and I don't claim to know what is the appropriate structure for every country, but I'd say that you have to look at the context within the country in which you are based. The other thing that you touched on, and I mentioned it a little bit in my presentation, is mainly in relation to your property. I probably could do a whole presentation on property and the challenges that you face in relation to it. But one thing I would say is that if you are physically present in a building, which maybe you paid for, you are renting, you may not own the land, but you are physically there, make sure that you either own the land If you do not own the land, make sure you have a proper legal contract in place. And whether that means you have a difficult conversation with a local bishop or not, it means that you have security. Because I have seen it so many times where a challenge, someone changes their mind, someone who was very generous in the past and has always said, no, I support the congregation very much and don't worry, I'll never change my mind. And all of a sudden, this person becomes 85 or 86, they have Alzheimer's, and their nephew comes along and says, the sisters have to leave. And there was no proper contract in place. Or the bishop changes and all of a sudden he decides that he would like something else for the land, and maybe someone is offering to build a golf course or something, and therefore you have to leave. Hopefully that's not a case, but you need to make sure that there are appropriate contracts in place for any property which you occupy, because otherwise you have no security, and it means that something could change at any time. And that's not a nice or a good situation. It's not a nice situation, but it's not a responsible situation to be in either. And if it means that a local leader or superior, whoever it is, has to have some kind of difficult conversation, surely that is worth it for stability of the congregation. So.
Okay. My own.
Thank you, Helen, for your input. Along the lines of the legal status, I think what is also important is to see how this legal status can evolve according to the demography of your congregation, because sometimes you will have very few sisters or aging sisters who are no longer able to manage the legal structure. And so I think this is part of the planning. Secondly, very often when properties built on land which does not, it's because the congregation does not have legal recognition. So I think that is another point that we can look in the planning for the future, is see whether as a congregation you can get legal recognition in the country where you are.
Okay. And my name is Stella, handmaids of the Holy Church Jesus. Mine is not really a question, but maybe to contribute to what Sister have just said, because he made mention of the places like in Africa, and I'm from there. You see, in most countries of Africa, our problem is not really with the civil society. Our problems is really with the church, okay? Especially with the bishop. Now, my advice would be the leadership team of every congregation should not try to enter any contract or into any project with the diocese in terms of friendship, okay? Because you meet a superior general or a provincial superior, a community superior who goes into a project with a bishop that they are close to or close with, no contract, nothing is set online, everything is done, and then the congregation enters into that project, and what the superior is doing is trying to impress the bishop. So all the while the congregation works towards providing money to the diocese and everything, and the congregation is suffering. Even the members of the community maintaining that project cannot even feed, okay? Now, the bishop that was friendly to the superior is gone, or maybe the superior is transferred. Another person comes in and the bishop does not like your nose. And that ends the thing. Okay, the next thing is you are just being sent away without no reason. And you are being sent away, and you are leaving because there was no contract. The Code of Canon Law has provided what it takes to enter any project and the contract that you should follow, what it should contain. So before you take up any project, make this contract, know what goes into where. How does the people in the project, how are they going to be sustained? What comes into the congregation at the end of this project? For how long is the congregation supposed to stay on this project? And when eventually you enter into this project, please, don't enter into any projects to impress any bishop or priest, okay? You have your responsibility. Be responsible. That also goes into the idea of transparency and collaboration. Please, those in the leadership team should let the sisters know what is going on in the congregation. Just as you said that the leadership are responsible for the stewardship, not only for the buses. Yes, I would say not only for the buses, but not just, it's for everyone. Even the sister that was professed tomorrow should be able to know what the congregation owns, because at the end of it, you go ahead fighting to get properties that you don't know where they are. Most of these properties at the end are being stolen because we don't even know where they are. And maybe the leadership team who bought these properties are no longer there. There was no inventory, nothing. And then you leave and we don't know where these properties are and they are gone. Most often in places like in Africa, when a new congregation is going into a place, the people are very generous. They begin to give you lands, hectares of lands, big, oh, sorry if I'm so fast. And then you accept this as a free will gift. There was no change of title. Nothing was written, no paperwork. And now the person who gave this property is dead or maybe old, and the children comes, this is our land, we need it back. And you said, oh, but it was given to us and you have built. Big buildings have been built on this. You have spent so much money. And then these people come in and say, this is our land, we want them back. And you said it's our own. You go to the court, you have no proof, no paperwork, nothing. And the leaderships who were there cannot say a word. And then you talk of inventory, even in the local communities. You know, there's this problem that some congregations have, a problem of common fund, which I am still thinking. I'm still thinking if it is a very good idea. Because in some congregations that operate common funds, it means that everyone works into a common fund. From there, the money is taken and taken care of everyone in the congregations. I see this, the advantages is there because everyone will be taken care of. But the disadvantage is that many sisters become very lazy and careless. Because whether you work or not, you're going to, you eat. Whether you work or not, you'll get your supplies, okay? And then you are in a small community where you have small properties that you can't account for them. You just waste them because whether you work or not, the congregation will provide. Okay? These are the things that inwardly we need to look into. It is something that is very real in every congregation, whether international or local. It is not only something that belongs to the bosses or the leadership teams, it belongs to all of us. Okay? We need to really look back. It's not enough for us to come to conference and listen to papers, but it's more for us to take what we get from the conference and go back home. And our leaders should be able to give listening ears to some of us that are not in their teams. You can imagine a congregation who will have someone who has studied accounting, finances, and everything. And issues comes up that demands an advice on this line, and that sister is there. Nobody is saying to her, sister, come, you studied this, what can we do on this? And then the leadership teams will just be there doing the thing the way they know. At the end of it, everyone suffers. I'm sorry if I'm talking too long, but I think I end here for now. Thank you.
That's great. I agree with you about contracts and that you should never enter into a contract based on friendship with a bishop. I completely agree with that. I think that one of the things, you know, in all of the different things you said, one of the things that I think is important is this aspect of knowledge that I spoke about today. And it's about having knowledge not only centrally, but being transparent with members of your congregation so that they too have knowledge, as you spoke about. And it's the sense of responsibility that every member, every sister should have in relation to finances. It's not just, yes, the ultimate responsibility is for the Superior General, but every sister and every member should feel that she has a personal responsibility for finance. I'm not sure exactly what you mean in terms of a common fund, but I think there is some truth to what you say in terms of if there is a common fund does that mean that sisters get lazy, or they think that they don't have to do anything and the money will just come? Part of that, I would say, is in relation to formation. But what are you telling your sisters about finance? What are you telling them about what their responsibility is for finance? And that, for me, is maybe more of a leadership issue than a planning issue. But it's just to reiterate that really finance is not just the responsibility of those in leadership or those who are working in the finance office. It's the responsibility of every sister within the congregation. And I think that sometimes it's a difficult thing for sisters to understand, because they think, oh no, the treasurer's responsible for that. I don't have to worry about it. But it's about communicating to your sisters as well. And if you give them information, then most of them, I'm not saying it's true for everyone, but most of them will be able to take it in and will be able to see a bigger picture. And then if you can see the bigger picture, does that help them then to take on their own responsibility? If they see, well, actually, no, here I am in Germany, but I can see that there's need in Senegal. Okay, so maybe I will change my own personal budget. So that means that my small action will have a difference for the other parts of the congregation. But without the knowledge, without that information, that sister cannot make that decision. So you need to be transparent and you need to give and share the information.
If I may add something based on the last, number one, no, I really thank you for your contribution. I think a lot of problems that we face in congregations is also partly because members have not been given, there may not have been the openness to be able to discuss these things in an open way. And we swallow a lot. So I'm very grateful that you spoke up, and I'm hoping that the more that we're able to do that in our congregations, the more we'll be able to face some of the situations that we're in, which brings me to my point that the audits or the gathering of knowledge that we do at a level really needs to involve every member of the congregation, because she may be able to bring information to the table that is not inventoried, simply because she's been present in a community where she's witnessed a sister who's doing favors in the name of the community for the local bishop or priest. And all of this information is necessary. So that's something that her intervention helped me understand. Do we have any more questions from, okay.
I'm Sister Marina. I belong to Sisters of Notre Dame, and I have a general question. You spoke about the aspect of structures, centralization, under the implications. Could you explain more about what are these structures you would suggest for the congregations based on the current realities, such as declining membership, changes in laws and regulations in each country, and ministry too?
It's difficult to say that there is a one structure fits all for religious congregations, because it depends on so many things in relation to that congregation. It depends on their current membership. It depends on possible future membership. It depends on current civil law structures that exist within the congregation, and current canonical structures that exist within a congregation. A lot of congregations, both now and over the last 10 years or so, particularly since I've been working in this area, so many congregations are talking about restructuring. It seems to be, it's a common theme, I think, in religious life. And really, I would say that the first thing I would say is that when you are looking to the future and looking at your future structures, the first thing that you need to consider is your mission. It should not be your finances. It should not be your civil law structures. It should be based on your mission and your membership. Because ultimately, this is what you're trying to sustain for the future, and you can make changes to finances, and you can make changes to your civil law structures that will support whatever future you see for mission. I think sometimes congregations look at it the opposite way round. They look at, well, where is our money, or where are civil law structures, and how can we use those to see how we can work for our mission in the future? And that's the wrong way of looking at it from my perspective. I think you need to consider first your mission and see, well, what canon law structures are appropriate based on our mission, and then see how your civil law structures can work with that.
I have a question, two questions, but we ask one of the people to ask the question live. And we also send to the English-speaking people the two documents that you have mentioned, Ellen, because people were asking. So they can download it directly on the chat. We put both of them. The question is from Roslyn. What would be your suggestion to prepare the future general treasurer of a congregation? Ability and capability is one thing, but the transparency and accountability is also important. Often capability and the values don't go together.
In terms of formation for a Treasurer General, and I look around nervously because I see Treasurers General present here today, and I'm sure some of them are online. But one thing I would say is you don't necessarily have to be a financial expert to be a Treasurer General. That is not what the main requirement for role of Treasurer General is. And in fact, I know many Treasurers General who don't even like numbers. And don't even really enjoy the financial aspect of their role. But ultimately, the role of a Treasurer General is about sustaining mission and upholding this mission and making sure that the resources of your congregation can sustain that mission. If they're not a financial expert, there are people, lay people, or maybe other sisters in your congregation who can help them with that. I would say also that a Treasurer General doesn't necessarily, yes, they are one person, but they can be supported in different aspects by different people, either within the congregation or externally within the congregation. I don't think there's one, set of skills that you have to say, this is what you need to be a Treasurer General. But ultimately, the person responsible for, for the finances, they don't necessarily have to be an expert in finances. Yes, they have to have a level of understanding, but they don't have to be the expert. That's what you bring experts in for. So I think it's much more important to have a Treasurer General who is willing to work with others and who is willing to work as part of a team and to support people and to help others understand what the mission is and what the role of the congregation is, rather than saying you must have a Treasurer General who has an MBA and a degree in accountancy and all of these things. I don't think that's helpful, really. Yes, it's helpful to a certain extent, but it's not a requirement for a Treasurer General. I think as well, finance does not have to be this very complex thing in terms of what I'm saying about formation. It's about having, taking responsibility for your personal finances and taking an interest in what is happening within your congregation. If you know that there is need in other parts of the congregation, you can say to your own provincial, well, what are we doing about that, both individually or as a province or as a wider congregation? It's about taking an interest and trying to understand the information that is being given to you. The responsibility of a Treasurer General is maybe to disseminate financial information in a way that it is easy for people to understand. That, I would say, is one of the most important skills of a Treasurer General. Being able to explain complicated things in a simple way. Because finance is not an easy subject for most people. But if you explain it to them in a simple way, and you can help them to see the reality, that is a much more important skill.
I have another question from the English group. We have the Italian group very silently online. And the question is, could you recommend reading resources on planning? Thank you very much for your helpful presentation, Ellen.
The first document I would suggest is still this one from Saviska, because it just gives practical guidelines and it really relates to religious life. The challenge about resources on planning is that most of the time, if you're trying to find resources on planning, they relate very much to corporate and business world rather than religious life. And yes, to a certain extent, you can apply those to religious life, but it's not as easy. So I would say, first step, read the document from Saviska. Try and answer the simple questions that I outlined in my presentation today. Take those as a first step. Even in terms of the 3 questions that I asked you on planning, try and answer those for your own congregation. That is a good first step to take, because it tries to help you see, well, what are we actually doing in relation to planning? One thing I want to very clearly say is that just because you prepare an annual budget or even a 3-year budget, this is not planning. So many groups, sometimes I work with them and they say, oh no, Helen, we plan, we look at the next year ahead, we plan our budget, we know what's happening. And I think, well, budgeting is not necessarily planning. You know, if I try and ask you the broader question of how are you planning to sustain your mission into the future, can you answer that question with next year's annual budget? No. So it's just to try and differentiate this requirement for planning with day-to-day administration of your finances. Day-to-day administration is important, but planning is really about looking at the wider picture. And so I think hopefully some of the questions I raised in my presentation, take those as a first step. And I will leave my contact details, and if you still require some more technical documents and resources on planning, I would be happy to share them as well. So I hope that helps.
Any other questions from here on the floor? And any others from the webinar? No. Okay. So thank you all for coming. I'm very, very grateful to Helen for the presentation that she gave, as well as for allowing all of you to have her PowerPoint in order so that hopefully can be an instrument that you can keep referring to as those of you who may want to try to do some of this in your own congregations. You'll have something that can support you in terms of going back to something and knowing what you can do for the future. I'd also like to thank Helen in a very, very specific way. Many of you are used to lining up out there, and we all have our sophisticated sheet of paper where we check everybody off and we collect €5. And none of you had to do that today because this is Helen's gift to us. So let's... And isn't it fitting that a seminar on economics is free? So I hope you all have enjoyed it that much more. There is nothing else scheduled in the near future from the UISD English speaking group, but we do hope to have a presentation with Mary Johnson. She has published a new book. We hope to have a presentation with her. She'll most likely be joining us by webinar, but we hope to organize something in October. And then, of course, if any of you know anyone who would volunteer to animate the Advent retreat, you all know who to contact. So keep that in your minds if someone comes to your mind, okay? And I wish all of you a very blessed Holy Week next week and a very blessed and happy Easter. Okay? Safe home.